Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's great to have everybody on from FixUS, and I am so excited to have Fiona with us today. Fiona is someone I've gotten to know a little bit now over the last couple of years, and is one of our key advisors here as we've talked about FixUS for some time. And I'm so grateful that she's joined us to talk about her new book, and we're going to kind of jump into that in a second. I encourage everybody, I have mine, I know Fiona's got it on the shelf, but please, folks, highly encourage folks to please pick up Fiona's new book. There's nothing for you here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Before we jump into the conversation, Fiona, I have to just make sure folks are aware, just very briefly, Fiona's bio background. Fiona is Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at the Center for the United States and Europe and Foreign Policy at Brookings. She recently served as a Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs for the National Security Council. Earlier, from 2006 to 2009, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and many other esteemed positions and academic posts prior to that. So Fiona, thank you so much for joining us. Fiona and I are going to have a conversation here back and forth about her book, and then we're going to field some questions. So as Ben said, please drop your questions in, and we're going to field as many as we can. Fiona, let's just kind of start off on just the big picture here on the book. I mean, you and I have talked, and I've read the book. I think it's fantastic. And what I found so interesting about it, and in my opinion, unique, is that it's obviously certainly part kind of memoir, sort of your life story, biography, but you're really doing it in a way that's trying to tie it to sort of a core underlying thesis and argument about how we've gotten to this point in our democracy, which is of central, obviously, focus and issue to FixUS. So we'll just start there. Let's take a step back. Like, tell us a little bit about the why here, like why you took this approach in this book, what you're trying to hope to convey with it.
Well, thanks so much, Mike, and also Ben for having me here today. And I do want to give a shout out to Mike and Maya and everybody else at FixUS, because you were very early people that I reached out to when I was thinking about doing this book project. Because initially I was a little uncertain as to whether I was actually going to write a book or not, as you might recall. I was looking for a way of getting more engaged, as many people are, in how do we address the problems that we're facing, especially in the wake of my experience at the first impeachment hearings 2 years ago, pretty much right around now, which had really disturbed me in all kinds of different ways. It wasn't my personal experience there quite so much, but just the kind of realization of what a predicament we were in as the United States, our democracy being challenged already then, and that's kind of 2 years ago, and we've moved so much further along on that process. I'd gone into the US government, into that position of Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director of the National Security Council for Russia and Europe, thinking that I was really focusing on a national security problem that was generated as much by Russia as anything else after the interference in the election. But I came out of that experience, and obviously out of the impeachment hearings, really worried about the United States and the state of our domestic politics, the partisan infighting, the polarization, not just the health of our democracy and the kind of stress testing of institutions that we'd been through, but really kind of wondering what it was going to take to get ourselves back on track, and knowing that this was now a national security crisis in itself. Because what I'd learned over that period of time is that the Russians were exploiting problems that were really generated here in the US, and that it was multifaceted: political partisanship, yes; polarization, yes; but also socioeconomic problems and a whole host of issues that have many decades in the way that they're generated. And of course, and I discovered as in talking to you and to many others that everybody else was already on that, but we're all kind of trying to figure out how do we work together to move things forward. And it was really the experience of giving testimony as a fact witness in the impeachment hearings that got me thinking along the lines of, well, perhaps maybe a book might be the best idea of how to try to frame this problem. Because I'd been compelled, it really felt like, to be honest, and not like just explain why, to put myself into the opening statement of my testimony by that experience there. Because in my time at the National Security Council, people like myself, professional experts on issues, national security, foreign policy, economics, you name it, were kind of seen as the enemy in a hyper personalized and very politicized, White House and political environment around it. It wasn't on any kind of ideological basis, but we weren't seen as part of what was very much a political team. And there was a lot more emphasis on the person of the president, on President Trump, and a really kind of wanton disregard on every front for people who are public servants. And they might be political appointees, people who'd had, a lot of experience in previous Republican administrations, which I had too. I worked under the George W. Bush administration as well as Obama's, but primarily under Bush as the National Intelligence Officer, and I was working with a lot of the same people that I'd worked alongside. But we were all being castigated as these sort of deep state, unelected, coup-plotting bureaucrats. It was all kind of fairly a mouthful. And I was really, seeing it firsthand, as I always had, about just what an amazing job public servants were doing, and how a lot of American public servants really reflect the country at large as a whole. And I felt in that testimony, when I was making the open statement, that I had to kind of then explain who I was, particularly as an immigrant with an accent, but, kind of what had propelled me towards serving the country, and, more about my biography. And it was, I sort of told a mini story. I mean, I was told by, my legal team, keep it short, don't go these opening statements go on for hours, everyone will lose the plot. So I actually tried to keep it very short. So it was a very truncated version of my personal biography and what America meant to me and what it meant being a citizen, an immigrant, and, the oath that I took to the Constitution, several times over. And, how much, I've felt just great affection and love for the country, and how I was worried about where we were. And that basically generated a whole set of responses. And it wasn't all negative. I mean, I got negative responses for testifying the first bit, but the personal part, the biography, the story at the beginning of the testimony, hundreds of letters from all the way around the country and from overseas as well. But people saying, I'd like to hear more of that story. And I thought, okay, well, if I can use the story or the storyline in my biography to basically act as a vehicle for these other issues, the public policy questions, the question about how do we get here politically, then, let me try to do that. Because initially, as talking to you, it's like, well, there are different ways of doing this, right? You can set up task forces. We can all kind of think about how we can kind of work together in the public policy space. But if a good story is what kind of brings people in, then let me try to do it. And I can't say I got it, right the first time. I've rewritten this, kind of a few times, sort of sitting behind me, right now on the shelf. And there was some pain involved in this until, I could figure out the formula. But, essentially, I've used my storyline, my biography, the kind of basically leaving behind the old coal fields of the northeast of England, very similar to anywhere in Pennsylvania, in the Lehigh Valley, as I explain in the book, and then getting to Washington, working in the White House, coming from the coal house to the White House, but as a kind of a story to frame how we got to where we are. And then, hopefully to sort of generate some ideas about how we might get out of it.
That's great. It's really great. And, I thought that obviously putting forward a story as a conversation starter is a huge method to use here to kind of inspire conversation. And that's obviously what a lot of us, we've tried to do that, many others are doing over the last few years, is trying to elevate some conversation about the deep rootedness of this problem. And I think using the story to do that is really helpful. And I think, I think you're really you're telling it in a unique way, both in terms of like tying your biography to sort of a vehicle to it. I think that's unique. But I think you're honing in on one that has been talked about before, but you're really focusing on this lack of opportunity. Right. I mean, this is, there's many different discussions going on about how much do, economic factors tie into the state of our democracy. And there's some debate, frankly, in the literature community on that.
Right, it's quite
We certainly come down on the side that they do. And obviously you do too. I think I'd love for you to just elaborate on that sort of, frankly, core argument there of the book that you tell your story to, of how lack of opportunity is sort of the central driver of this moment we're in.
Yeah, I mean, we're all obviously rather fixated on this idea of kind of culture wars, value wars as well. But, a lot of culture is rooted in, an economic frame. And, let me just sort of explain that from my own personal perspective. I saw, and this is what I do to kind of lay out in the book, from the region that I came from, again, that could be a correlate, a stand-in for many places in the United States, that the identities of everybody around me were rooted in what they did, as their job. It wasn't a career or profession, but it was rooted in the job and in the workplace. So I come from a long line of coal miners. Obviously, as a girl, I probably wasn't going to go down the mine, even if the mine had still been open. But nonetheless, some of the people I was closest to in my life growing up, my dad, my granddad, all of my granddad's brothers, his father and his father before him had all basically gone down the mines, and their whole lives traced the trajectory of the rise of anthracite coal mining in northern England, and the whole industrial revolution and the emergence of prosperity. And all of the communities in my locality grew up around the coal mines. So if you looked at basically the maps and the information from County Durham, which is like Carbon County in the Lehigh Valley, in Pennsylvania, you'd see that in 1801, it's just a whole bunch of little villages and small market towns. And then, fast forward to the 1880s, and the place has just boomed. The population has multiplied, many-fold, and villages have become towns. And every village is a pit village. And villages in the UK are actually more like towns in the United States. I've always kind of been a bit thrown off in the US that people call about towns and cities, and we call a village and a town, in the UK side, because much I would think, tighter urbanization there. We're always into categorization of everything anyway. And every place would have multiple pits, multiple mines. And someone like my father or my grandfather, if one mine closed or they were kind of, it wasn't as profitable, these were all privately owned then, they all kind of basically move around from pit to pit. And, it's often hard to move, but, kind of they move around. All the housing, everything is tied to the pit. And then all of the pastimes of the miners, the community is all tied to the pit village as well. And their identity, everything is there. Their families, their kids, everything, education, you name it, is all tied into that work. The communities become, very rich in terms of community life. So the miners' dues, when they start to organize themselves, the miners' association, it's not just organizing for strikes or for collective wage bargaining or just, security and safety, which of course is very important. But it's also because they organize themselves to have soccer teams. They have writing circles, miners' literacy, miners' education. They club together if somebody gets injured. There's all this sort of mutual self-help. There's not individuals, there's communities, and they all rely on each other. And so when those communities lose their workplace, the whole sense of self-identity, the community, its values, its culture, and it was a culture because they also have their own language as well, which is a mark of culture. My dad spoke something called Pitmatic, which basically has different syntax, different word use. It's kind of closer to sort of old English than it is to modern English. And it was just, kind of mining terms, and everybody sort of knew them in this vicinity. And that all disappears. And so my dad, when he lost his last job in a pit, when he was in his 30s, after that, he goes to work in a steelworks, that closes down, a brickworks, that closes down. And eventually he gets a job as a porter, an orderly and auxiliary worker in the local hospital. It's on the lowest level of the economic rung. Nobody knows what a porter does apart from push people around the hospital in his view. He's always a miner. It's all he ever talks about. And there's just that sense of loss and dislocation, even though he's actually a quite positive person. But his whole identity had gone. And that's what I mean about, we get into these kind of culture and values laws, and we don't realize that they're kind of also rooted in some of these other, economic factors as well. And people are too frightened to talk about this because they worry about being labeled a Marxist or anything like this as well. But, miners in these mining communities, they were very capitalistic, even though the mines became nationalized after World War II to help the mine industry recover. Everybody wanted to do better. I mean, my dad was kind of a bit of a, the Soviets would have called him a Stakhanovite or a shock worker. In the 1950s, his goal was to hew and produce as many coal as possible so that he could earn money. And he would travel around in Europe. He had like a great, life in his view in his 20s in the 1950s. And it's then that, the kind of decline sets in. And everyone has ambitions. They want their kids to get better educated. They're fairly socially conservative, but they know they want to have a better life. And that kind of gets taken away from them because the workplace disappears, their identity disappears, and nothing new comes in.
Right, right. No, that's right. You talk a lot, building off of that. I mean, you talk, as you lay out the story and argument in the first part of the book in a compelling way, you then pivot to sort of the explaining that what's lacking now as a result of some of these forces economically over the last several decades is a lacking a infrastructure for opportunity, right? I hope you could talk about that a little bit. I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of just kind of explain the concept there, like what you mean there, but like you talk about a lengthened book, encourage folks to check it out, but like to synthesize what you see as maybe some of the core elements, right, of what that infrastructure opportunity looks like.
Yeah, there's multiple levels to that. I mean, sometimes it's actually literal physical infrastructure, like the infrastructure bill, that we're talking about, on Capitol Hill right now, because, people can't get to a workplace if they don't have any physical mobility unless it's right next door. And, all those mining villages were built right next to the coalface. I mean, my dad would walk across the field and down the drift mine, for one of his mine jobs. Further afield, you might have to get on your bike and cycle there, or longer walk and get up early. But you always relied on some means of getting there. Sometimes there was a mine bus, and that would come and pick people up because people didn't have cars. There was no sort of individual car ownership there. So physical mobility is important. The infrastructure that gets you from A to B to get a job, and that obviously is part of that. So if you suddenly find yourself out of a job and the next job is like 2 counties over, what are you going to do? You're not going to be able to get there. And you may not then have the other parts of the infrastructure of opportunity, means information to find out about the jobs and how you can move, and kind of ways of finding new housing, and then schools and other things for your kids. All that information is part of that infrastructure of opportunity. Education is a critical part. That's why I mentioned schools for your kids, because part of that is, are you qualified for whatever opportunities there? An opportunity obviously is a job. It's, kind of the ability to carve out a life for yourself. And part of it, leisure, comes into that as well. Can you do something outside of the workplace, or is it all just going to be work, 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 which often, I guess, we all feel like here in the US, or certainly did until, more recently. And, education in a lot of these mining villages was fairly circumscribed, because people were just expecting you to go down the pit, as soon as possible. My dad left school at 14, and kind of there wasn't much education beyond that, apart from the Durham Miners Association stepping up to create these miners literary societies where they could learn more things. And it wasn't necessarily job related, but it's the opportunity to kind of learn more, opportunities on the job for more qualifications that might be transferable. The education system overall opening up new doors for new opportunities, which is what happened to me, because there was an opening up of the education system in the United Kingdom. And then it's the wherewithal factor to be able to take advantage of these opportunities, not just the physical infrastructure, but, and the informational space, but do you have resources? And if you don't have your own resource and you can't generate your own wealth, which, a lot of miners, had a hard time saving up, unless, like my dad, I mean, if they, were able to work well and they could, set aside some money, there were some limits to what they could do with it. Often they couldn't afford to buy a house, but, they could do, various things with it. But if you don't have the wherewithal to generate wealth, where are the funding to take advantage of these opportunities going to come from? In my case, my family, didn't have the means to basically pay for me to go to school, but there were grants and subsidies. My local education authority had still emphasized its educational budgets, even in dark times when all the mines and everything else were closing down. And I had everything fully paid for to go to college, which, obviously in the United States, after the expansion of education with the GI Bill after World War II, and again with the implementation of the Pell Grants, and, sort of setting up all kinds of funding for, first generation students to go to college, community college, or 4-year college, 2-year college. That made a big impact in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, a lot of that part of the infrastructure of opportunity has disappeared. And partly it's because there's a sort of a different thinking about opportunity. We used to sort of think about opportunity at different times as kind of opportunity for a whole community, opportunity for all, we tend to emphasize, particularly since the 1980s and onwards, it's individual opportunity.
Right.
You know, and I mean, of course, that's also part of the whole American thinking, but the same thing happened in the UK with Margaret Thatcher coming in. I'm a bit harsh on Margaret Thatcher in the book, but partly it's because she believes that everything is dependent on the individual, not on the community. Because she, in her own life experience, she was the daughter of an entrepreneur, a grocer, you know, self-made man who had a shop. Although I think they probably weren't aware that they were dependent on the means of the community around them, because if you don't have customers with, you know, a disposable income, you know, you don't have a shop. If people in my hometown, the shops all closed down because people didn't have any money to spend in them. You know, but it's that whole sense of a kind of a community and a fabric of a community of sort of mutual support. You know, it's kind of been eroded over time as being important. We all have fed into the myth that we've all done it on our own, which is actually one of the reasons I wanted to write this book in this way. I didn't do it all on my own. Yes, I studied hard. When some of the opportunities came along, I took them, but it was because of an infrastructure of opportunity, grants, you know, people to help me out, mentorship. I mean, infrastructure of opportunity, can somebody just decide to give you advice and tell you what to do? People helping me to kind of get to an interview for something. I had, you know, and I describe in the book, one professor buy me a suit because I didn't have a suit. And, you know, and things like this. This is all part of that infrastructure of opportunity. It's multifaceted, and it's what gives you the chance to take advantage of an opportunity. And it comes from a larger, you know, societal fabric. It's not just all on the individual.
Yeah, no, I like the framing of it a lot as a way of bringing in both the what the public sector role here is in this, but it's not only the public sector role; it's the broader community and individuals themselves, but and how they can create a broader fostering of an infrastructure of opportunity. I think it's a really good framework to think about. We have a bunch of people submitting questions. I'm going to get to them in a second. Keep them coming in, folks. I'm going to ask a more broader question first before we get to the questions. It's kind of a broader step back kind of question. I mean, you talk a lot, obviously, in the book in terms of tying that argument to the populism, right? And how lots have been written about this too, that we're living through a moment of populism, and of populist leaders, you know, building off of this. And I've always kind of thought about this in a way, it's sort of a simple point, but like when you think about populism and what it is, right? And definitions, but a political dynamic of the people versus elites and establishment, right? Like that the nature of that is in and of itself not really like a bad thing, right? Like, I mean, like that that people are actually, you know, reacting to something. They're reacting to a system that's not hearing them or listening to them, and it's what's done with it that is wrong or has negative impacts. And I'm curious if you think about that assessment, because it seems to me, if that's true, the nature of what we're facing right now is it's about how you channel that. Like, how do you channel this populism to more constructive means, right? And I'm curious how you think about that. It's like, what is the sort of starting points of answers of how one thinks about, if that's the theory of the case, how do we best channel that towards more constructive means?
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you. I mean, populism is sort of a style and an approach, you know, in politics. I mean, we're in a very complex time where fixing all of this, you know, as you're pointing out in all your work at FixUS, is being to be difficult. It's not going to be quick. It may take a couple of generations as well, and you know, people don't want to hear that because you know there's a lot of frustration building up. And you know, why is something still not being done? Who's going to fix it? Who's going to do something for us? And when populism becomes, you know, quite dangerous is when there's an awful lot of promises made without any plan, you know, which we saw in the case of Brexit in the UK, a lot of promises, a lot of kind of ideas that sound kind of like good in theory, but then there's no plan, you know, for how you're going to put things into place. But also when the leadership basically short circuit democracy and starts talking about just the people and the leader. And it's basically trying to, I would essentially just say, sort of win over votes for some kind of, you know, personal agenda or private gain. And, you know, we've seen that a little bit too often, you know, kind of in these sort of circumstances in history as well as, you know, internationally, not just, you know, to where we are here in the United States. Another thing about, populism, because it is a style and approach, it can pop up on the left and on the right. But as you said, it can also be channeled, because if you've got this frustration, this grievance, and people wanting to see things done, then, there is a kind of question of how can you deliver on that? And I do think we're all grappling with how best to do it, because there is that sort of legislative dimension. And, what we see in the infrastructure bill and the kind of reconciliation bill, there's an awful lot of those elements that are popular, individually. I think that the big question is, how do you put them all together? And of course, how do you pay for it, which is is a big issue. And I think the scale of things, is overwhelming for people. And that's because everyone thinks of a public sector approach to things. And I have a friend from Italy who's an economist who I asked to read the book early on. He said it was interesting that a lot of my comments at the back in terms of ideas of what you could do were very private and individual focused. He said in Europe, you'd somebody writing that would have the state should do this, the state should do that. There'd be all the public policy dimensions. Because I do think that as the situation is so daunting, and as the scale of it is so colossal, it can't all be done, of course, from the top. I mean, you just kind of pointed it yourself. We all have to have agency in this. It has to be a public-private partnership. I mean, I grew up again in communities where there was a lot of mutual support and self-help. There wasn't a lot of people in my family waiting around for some kind of handout. They wanted a hand up, but they were also willing to do things themselves. And I do think in a lot of communities around the United States, particularly, the sort of state and local government level, people want to work. If they can't work, they want to volunteer. They want to kind of find a way of doing something for themselves as well, because that gives meaning to life and identity. So I talk in the book about my hometown, which after decades of nothing happening there, has had a huge infusion of philanthropic assets from a project that's been financed and by an individual UK philanthropist. But the whole point of the project, which is called the Auckland Project, is to bring people in the town into this as active participants, as volunteers, or kind of people who can work on this kind of project to transform the town and make it into a tourist centre and put on all these kind of live performances. It's quite similar to what's been happening in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and some other places, for example, where they've got like these local development corporations have been set up. In this case, it's had to come from external philanthropy because the town didn't have any assets. But it's where the people of the town or the city and the region are thinking about themselves about how best they want to approach this. So it's no good having everything coming down from on the top. And I think that there's, different ways of getting at the same questions about how do you build this infrastructure of opportunity. I mean, obviously you're going to have, major allotments of funds for reconstructing roads and railways and bridges, and I mean there are different ways of how to do this through toll roads and other ways that kind of can alleviate some of the burden on the public purse, so to speak. But there's all kinds of other things that could really make a difference at sort of different societal levels, on the local government, neighborhood, community, individual level. So there's all kinds of different mechanisms. The question is, how do we really network it all together?
Right.
How do we kind of basically get a concerted effort?
Well,
some
it's
leadership
also,
from the top, but leadership, further down, which is, where I think, you, FixUS, and many other groups can come into this as well. Again, public, private, non-profits, for-profit, private companies. I mean, we can see that individual philanthropy. It's just how do we bring it all together?
bringing it all together and networking is obviously the critical importance and the most critical challenge. But I think that the real added point here too, what you're saying is sort of the matching of, it's not just, it's the different spheres of society that need to be brought to bear, but it's also the public versus individual responsibility here, is I think a really important frame. It's often missed, right? I think in these discussions in the way that you've done it, and I think a balanced way. So okay, let's go to the questions because we're not going to be able to get through all of them. Probably we'll try as many as we can. Okay, let's try this one. One of the gentlemen asks here, said Robert Kennedy, who they worked for, they said, has often said moral courage was the most important quality in public servants. Based on your courageous example, it's asking how might we encourage others to speak out, and display moral courage, right? As you did.
Well, I think part of it can be by all of us setting an example, right? I mean, Robert Kennedy's brother John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I mean, this is the anniversary this year of his essentially call to arms of the citizens to do something for the country, and to sort of celebrate public service, volunteering, and people who really want to stand up and actually do something. So I think by all of us speaking out and setting an example in whatever public sphere that we can. I mean, look, that could be anywhere. That could be on a school board. It can be, within a kind of a community group. It can be, it doesn't have to be, out there in the public in the way that I and, others who I work with found ourselves during the testimony. It can be, honestly, writing a letter to your congressperson, because actually I think we could do with a bit more moral courage among some of our members of Congress right now, to basically call it as they see it. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why a lot of people feel very constrained in that regard. And we've seen flashes of that, but, I think we need to see a little bit more, and we've all got a voice. And, in theory, people are representatives, but we can also represent ourselves, finding ways of public engagement. I think going out to schools, going out to colleges and universities, inside of the private sector. If you're in a company or kind of a big corporation, small, large, you can kind of speak out within it for better business practices, better treatment of your employees, for example, breaking down some of the barriers and obstacles that people face for opportunity and advancement. Yeah. There's many different ways that we can do this. I think just in every situation, try to use your voice, but do it. And again, I would sort of say in harmony. When I was a kid, I was in a youth choir. I wasn't so great as a soloist. I was much better singing along as to kind of, mask some of the scratchy bits in my voice. But it's like, how do we all kind of work together and, add our voice to things that other people are doing that we know, are likely to make a difference?
That's good. I think it's an interesting question. So someone asked, having worked in the NSC, how do we demystify governmental organizations so people understand their role and don't just think they're a giant conspiracy?
Oh, I know, my God. I mean, that was kind of another reason for writing the book, because it was so bizarre, to be on the receiving end of these conspiracies and being written into them. I kind of, my mind was blown by the ideas of all these things that people thought I was doing. I thought, first of all, God, I mean, I haven't got time in the day to do all of this. I'm trying to juggle getting my groceries done, or, taking my 14-year-old to a soccer game. I haven't got time for all these like great big world conspiracies, hanging out with God knows who, doing God knows what, kind of really come and just join me for my life. And actually that made me start to think we need to basically open up a lot of our, government, not just to more transparency, which you and, many others, we've got Max Steer and the Partnership for, right. Public service, and others who try to demystify this with Public Service Week. But think about how people could actually work shadow people, kind of not think of they're part of a shadow, but kind of conspiracy, but get to see what people do. Because another thing that struck me and many of the other fact witnesses during the testimony was we got letters from people saying, now we see who you actually are, what kind of people you are. You're kind of normal people. Yes, thanks, we don't have three heads. And you're actually doing jobs. Now we understand what your jobs are. I mean, I literally had colleagues who got letters from their great aunts saying, oh no, I understand what you're doing. We need to get out there more and tell people what public servants do. Public Service Week, I mean, it might not make the best HBO series, drama series. Yeah. Like work shadowing the odd kind of person in OMB or something, but we do need to get out there, get school kids to kind of come in and see kind of what people do, and people to get out there and talk about what they do, particularly young people, because one of the problems now in the federal government is we're having a real generational crisis. Yeah. An awful lot of people who come in from younger generations have been through the military and they still want to serve the country, so they've got the bug for public service. But younger people leaving college, for example, any kind of college, it's not really the first thing they think about in terms of federal government service, because it's become so unpopular and so tainted. State and local government, maybe, an awful lot of people will go and work, for their governor or, their mayor or something. But we're really having a hard time getting people into federal service. And again, the generational change is acute right now because we need to bring more people in. So I do think we need to have an active engagement, and I know Max Steer and others, trying to do all of that, but whichever ways we can do. I mean, people like Nick Panetta on, your board as well, getting him and others who are these distinguished public servants to get out there like they are and to talk to people, but find younger people too. We need to have a kind of a cross-generational coalition of public servants, find younger people and, kind of bring them out to talk to schools and, other public settings about what they do.
Yeah, it's a critically important moment to do it, both because of the state of our democracy, but also, yeah, from a demographics perspective, there's a huge retirement wave, leaving a big gap.
Exactly, big gap, yeah.
Government right now, so that's a really good point. This question someone posed here, a little bit longer one, I'll try to get through it, but saying lack of opportunity may indeed provide ground for the angst we're seeing. But these days, we see polarization that involves players who have plenty of opportunity, right? I believe in this saying political angst and polarizations being driven by outrage politics, right?
Yeah.
So the point here is that the case that this goes way beyond just opportunity, is people are willing to suspend disbelief in lies and continue on the road to outrage, is how they put it. Obviously, I agree with that. I mean, but
yeah, I agree too. It's very well put. Yeah.
Right. So I guess the question is like the question they're putting here is kind of going beyond the opportunity. Their thoughts on how to mitigate political angst. We can fix the opportunity, but how do we address the quote outrage side of politics?
Yeah, I mean, look, this really is the kicker, and I completely agree. I mean, opportunity, I kind of see it as the sort of like the base layer, that you really have to address, because it provides the kind of base of grievance, frustration, you name it, and kind of people feeling that they're not. It's not just having gainful employment, but they haven't got the wherewithal or the means to improve their lives overall. Their well-being, is affected. The work by Angus Staton and Anne Case at Princeton on the deaths of despair, are all kind of related to that people's lack of opportunity in terms of education and a job, both of which are intertwined. And they and many others have shown that the new class divide in the United States goes on whether you've got any kind of college education after high school. And even if you might have come from a wealthy family, but if you don't go on to do a college degree, it doesn't matter also your racial background either. It's starting to show up, across the board. If you haven't gone on and taken that opportunity to have some kind of college education, or higher further education, skills qualification, you're really excluded. And that then does feed into some of these, political phenomenon that the questioner is touching upon too. So I think part of this is trying to encourage people that education is a good thing, not the bad thing. It's that what you were sort of saying at the beginning, Mike, about the people not seeing themselves reflected in the elites.
Yeah.
And so part of this does have to be sort of a communication and a it's definitely a communication challenge, but also a concerted effort to help people kind of see what people do across the government and ways in which people can participate that's not in the partisan political arena. Because I completely agree with the way that the question was framed. I mean, just like the algorithms on Facebook are pushing everyone towards outrage and to hate speech or conspiracies and lies and the kind of stories and information that sort of just gets a lot of clicks because it's just so outrageous and you're kind of drawn to it all the time. Our politics is doing the same. It's like shock jock politics. And it's much more on the performance rather than actually, and I mean the political performance, the showmanship, rather than the public policy aspect of politics.
Yeah,
I think in a way we have to push through this from different layers, from outside of the partisan political system, to have demonstration projects to show that things can work and to be able to try to get other people to come out and see that physically. So, I mean, again, finding some things that you can have these good news stories, real stories. I mean, it'll take some hard work. And I know that you're trying to think about this all the time. Get out there, get around the country, bringing people in to talk to people who have actually made a difference and can actually show that there's different ways of doing things than running for Congress and having to be, this kind of political performance artist who's out there just sort of shouting and drawing attention to yourself. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's, we have to make a concerted effort on this front.
I'm going to pick up on one thing you said, and then I'll go back to the other questions here, but want to build on something you said there. I mean, you know, in many ways, you're right. I mean, I agree. The lack of opportunity, right? It's like it's a base of what all these problems are kind of building off of. If you don't have that, right, it leaves the environment fertile for a lot of these other issues. At the same time, I think over the last 10 plus years, the outrage amplification has taken on a whole new level. And
Oh yeah.
many people believe, and obviously there's been lots of talk about this very recently, of the role of technology here. You started to speak to
Hmm.
that within there. And obviously you have deep experience on this from the national security side in terms of witnessing how technology was used against us, right,
Exactly.
on
Yeah.
these issues. I'd love to dig into that just for a couple of minutes. I mean, you want to step back and kind of evaluate a little bit on, you know, how do you see the role of these of technology here and sort of fomenting this, and more specifically, I guess, how do we start to think about what we need to do to sort of deal with that, reform some of these sorts of issues to address what is, like, in my opinion, sort of the ultimate kind of amplifier of these challenges these days.
I mean, it is the amplifier, and as you said, it's an amplifier that people from outside can use. And it should be no surprise when you think about the Russians and the security services in Russia and their interference in our elections using Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube, and trying to kind of push content there. Twitter bots amplifying the discord and the hatred. I mean, just things that we produce, nothing that they were producing. Or posing as Americans on chats and on Facebook to just kind of stir things up and stir the pot. Well, what's Putin doing right now? They're trying to constrain the internet. They're kind of worried that that might come right back at them, but they want unity. They don't want division in their own states. And so they're really trying to kind of clamp down, and they're trying to control and regulate the content. The Chinese have done it for ages, the great Chinese firewall that kind of, goes around their internet. And they're perfectly happy to avail themselves of the unregulated cyber, wild west, anytime they can to make problems for us that, rather pile on to the problems that we're generating from ourselves.
Right.
So I think we've all reached this stage now where, yep, it's become obvious we have to do something to regulate, and that the companies themselves aren't that great at self-regulating. But we do still, have the freedom of speech to uphold. So I think we're obviously going to have to tread pretty carefully here. One of the things that I find the most challenging in this regard is in the disinformation space, because we're producing a lot of disinformation internally. And I've spoken out a few times about, not because everybody has the big lie about, the stealing the election in 2020, but just generally lies. And I had a, kind of somebody emailed me recently. He said, "So who gets to decide what's a lie or not then? Is it a bureaucrat?" Well, bizarre way of thinking about this. I mean, is that what they tell their kids? Kind of, I don't know who the person was, because it's anonymous, classic anonymous, kind of email. Because I am most deliberately not on, the kind of the basically social media. I use LinkedIn to, connect with some people, Facebook to, send my cousin in Australia happy birthday wishes, about this kind of thing. But I don't engage because it's just, kind of a crazy world out there that I don't want to be part of. But here I get, the anonymous email, easy enough to track down. I think that in itself is an absurd question about, who gets to do, and that's the world that we're in right now. There's the Orwellian line that I've been quoting recently: in a world of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. But somebody is, even challenging that there isn't such a thing as truth. So there becomes the kind of the problem that we're grappling with now. How can we get back any kind of sense of that there's objective facts out there? We've had that problem with COVID and the pandemic. Our scientists can't even sort of state objective facts. Public health experts can't. Objective fact, put on a mask and it, helps to slow down the, the transmission of the disease, or doesn't completely halt it, but will, kind of mitigate the transmission of the disease, etc. So that's going to be a major challenge. It has to be, again, multifaceted. Members of Congress and people who have credibility to the people who support them. He's looking at you first of all, because the more that you kind of play into this space and don't have the moral courage, going back to that question before, more people's lives are being put at risk. Their deaths are on you. If you're not sort of speaking out on the basis of objective facts. I'm sorry, but that's the way that it is. you know, you have a responsibility, just like, you know, if somebody was piloting a plane and they deliberately flew into a flock of birds or something, or, you know, did something, that would be, you know, on them. That's essentially members of Congress are piloting a plane, you know, for all the passengers from their constituencies there. And people are looking to them, you know, for the guidance in their safety and security. So there's that kind of element in it. Then there's the schools, and, you know, obviously we're now in a situation where there's all these battles over school boards and, you know, what can be taught and what cannot be taught. And I mean, just, you know, coming from, you know, the background that I did, where education was a privilege, you know, you were supposed to kind of apply that that education, you know, having, you know, access to that knowledge was a right. I mean, education was not politicized, you know, the kind of a way out. And, you know, I sometimes kind of think that an awful lot of the people who are politicizing it have the luxury of doing so, because they're not the people, which is often the case, who are suffering the most from a lack of opportunity or a kind of a lack of education. But they're kind of people who kind of seeing this now as a playground, you know, kind of for political or private, political games or private gain. And this, you know, kind of, so we have to tackle this on so many different fronts. The media, you know, kind of trying to sort of reestablish kind of baselines, calling out lies, restoration of local media, because everything has become nationalized. And we've lost, you know, kind of people's feelings of connection to local media, for example. Everything is on a national level or on the internet.
Yeah, that's right.
It's really tough. It's very hard. And again, it can't be done from the top down of the government, because there's no trust in the government there. And that isn't the way that we should be doing this. So how can we, again, network and, you know, get people motivated at different levels to tackle this is the challenge.
Yeah, well said, well said. It's the technology challenge here is one that is certainly one I am not the most well versed in. I, like you, Fiona, don't not participate in many of the social media channels these days for a variety of reasons. But I just do think there's no doubt that all these different trends that many people have spoken to, what's driven polarization and distrust, have been around for decades, but some changed in the last 10 years. And the last 10 plus years of the amplification of this due to technology, I think is a massive challenge that I think, you know, certainly has been getting significant attention in the last several weeks. And I think one of which I think, in my view, we're kind of at the early stages of really starting to have that conversation.
And COVID has made it worse, of course, because here we are all in the Zoom world.
Sure.
You know, kind of, so, you know, we're not physically meeting with each other, which I think does take the edge sometimes off. When people can physically see a person, you know, that they're, and particularly because we've got these risks from artificial intelligence, that maybe, you know, sometimes the person you see is not the actual person. You know, there was a kind of big scandal in the UK where, you know, the Queen recently was sort of digitalized, kind of appearing to be saying something that she wasn't, you know, for example. You know, so we saw there was a case of Nancy Pelosi and having a doctored video during some, you know, kind of political, you know, campaign segment. So there's all kinds of risks that, you know, we have here with this too, that COVID is amplified because we're all stuck behind our computers. So hopefully we can get out there physically and, you know, kind of get our humanity back a bit.
Oh, I hope so soon. It's an interesting question. We touched on this in this way. I mean, so one attendees asked, our government at the federal level, right, was last like had major reorganization, like way back in 1948, right, in terms of like new, you know, departments and cabinet positions of mass restructuring, right, that took place to meet the challenges of the post-World War II, right, landscape. So it's a basic question, obviously, based on your experience in government, right? Is our government set up to deal with the rise of populism? If not, do you have views on sort of broader restructuring, reorg of government to meet these challenges?
Yeah, and it's not just the challenges of, you know, populism, it's all the challenges that we're facing now. I mean, we're now going into yet another big economic dislocation period, right? I mean, if we're trying to tackle climate change, which we're going to have to adapt to at this juncture, and if we're really kind of serious about moving into technologies that will, you know, basically help to mitigate that, and into a world that is, you know, full of battery-operated electric vehicles and artificial intelligence, and, you know, where every car is a supercomputer and our whole house might be a supercomputer as well. This is going to whole change, you know, the whole way that our society operates, not just the nature of work. And there's going to be massive dislocations. And I do think with climate change, we're going to have an awful lot of outward migration from places that are not going to be sustainable. I mean, look what's happening in, California, and, going from droughts to the cyclone bomb, the Gulf, more and more hurricanes, some people getting hit over and over and over again. Parts of the United States, sadly will become uninhabitable, along with lots of other parts of the world. We're going to have constant adaptation. And our government is not flexible and nimble. We were reconstructed, as the question, suggests, in the wake of World War II, to deal with moving from the war economy to this new mass manufacturing economy, which was thinking about, new prosperity, rebuilding, building for the future, but in a mass workplace. The auto industry, for example, the steelworks kind of coming, back on again. That's not where we're going to be in the future. And absolutely, we need our government to be adapted to that. I mean, I think we need less of the kind of behemoths, departments. I mean, I don't think we necessarily, shrinking the government isn't the solution on its own, because it's like, what's the mission? And I mean, how do you get flexibility and adaptability? It's not that many people work for the federal government. There's a couple of million, kind of in total. And, there's also the military, the postal service. I mean, again, our postal service is needing to adapt. Everything is going to have to, kind of be basically fit for purpose for what lies ahead of us. These wrenching dislocations and change, and how we're going to be able to not just survive, but prosper, and competition with China, and the whole way that the international system is operating. I mean, that our State Department is going to have to be restructured, for example, because we used to rely an awful lot. The numbers of foreign service officers is infinitesimally small. We used to rely in most places on local hires, and that's become really problematic. In places like Russia, where the Russian government said, no, sorry, you can't hire Russians to work here anymore. Our operations are there on a shoestring. Places like, Turkey, where they detain our local employees, and persecute them and accuse them of coup plotting and all kinds of things. And other places where, they just have a lot of restrictions on this and constraints. We're going to have to think about, the role of the foreign service, and there's more emphasis on trade and economics in those relationships than, there used to be. So I think absolutely we need to be thinking about how we change our government. We don't maybe have to do those wholesale, from the top down reorgs, and certainly not do it in a kind of ad hoc crazy fashion, like moving, the Department of Agriculture up to Iowa because it's kind of closer to the farmers, or, kind of some of the motivations there, particularly when the nature of farming is changing as well. And, and certainly then trying to shrink government so you get rid of agronomists and meteorologists and all the people who are going to have to help us with adaptation to, the stringencies of a new climatic conditions. We really need to think long and hard about how our government is positioned, to help us move forward. So absolutely, this is definitely a time, an inflection point again with COVID, climate change, and still 10 years on from the Great Recession.
Yeah, it's really good question. Okay, we're almost out of time.
Sorry, I'm kind of talking too long here. I was just looking at the clock, realizing, sorry.
So I'll go one more. I'm going to use this question from John here to kind of tee it up here a little bit, and I think it's a good one to end on. And so John first said, Fiona, thank you for your service to our country, which I obviously second 1,000%. But one way, John says, one way to look at our societal challenges is that our interactive societal systems like values, politics, economics, education, how we use technology have just gotten too big and complex.
Yeah.
Collectively, they're destroying our fabric of community, right? Without community, we have no society. I was asking, what do you think of that perspective? And do you think focusing on the infrastructure of opportunity is the best place to start changing our direction? I thought that's a good one to
Yeah, that's right. And that's really well put, John. Yeah. And look, let's just say it's one place to start, right? And I mean, I think that's kind of, part of the dilemma of the infrastructure bill on Capitol Hill. I mean, we all know that pre-K, universal pre-K, there's loads of research that shows that's kind of pretty essential, childcare to get women, back into the workplace, access to college, kind of community college, further education for people. But then you have to kind of pick and choose, and what's the best place to choose? And people say, well, I don't know where to choose. But I'm just kind of saying there's one place that we can start, but it has to be and, not either or. Right. And, how can we generate some, I would say, demonstration effect? So there's one organization that I would encourage, and it's just one, again, as a place to start, that I would encourage people to take a look at. So as I was working on the book, but I'd already got too far along to include it, I came across a group in Portland, Maine, Portland Community Squash. And it's just this incredible community effort run by, a really inspired group of people, led by, young guy, Barrett Tarkishian, who, come from a pretty privileged background, but wanted to make his life in Maine. And it's kind of, his area, didn't want to leave, and thought about how he could bring his skills there. He was an accomplished squash player. And he decides to set up this community squash. And it's basically bringing in all of the families from low income immigrant families, along with their kids into this kind of community endeavor around squash. But they're also including mentorship, educational opportunities for kids, giving them guidance all the way through school. I mean, they're going through elementary to middle to high school. They're getting all the community to come up with funds at the grassroots and, elsewhere, and getting outside invested in, so the kids don't have to pay for anything. They have transportation, they have food programs, they get their families all involved in it. It's very similar to the old mining communities that, kind of my dad grew up in, that I got the tail end of. Where people were kind of generating things for themselves, for their community, and everyone was pitching in. And you might get the local Rotary Club would give some money, the Durham Miners Association, but the miners would do things themselves. Everything from bake sales to sometimes whist drives and domino games where they'd gamble, and then the money would go into the kind of local community pot. This is what this is. This is like an incredible community endeavor, and they're going national. And again, it doesn't have to be squash. It could be drama. It could be, and in Maine writ large, there's these kind of community vouchers that kids can get to participate in something. It could be art, it could be photography, it could be drama, it could be soccer, it could be football, it could be all kinds of different things, but kind of giving kids in particular, and then their families, something to get engaged in. And, again, if we start thinking about that in some of the poorest communities, and thinking about how things could be brought into from the outside that could then become sustainable, and then how that could be regionalized, and how it will help kind of kids not just get an opportunity to play squash or an opportunity for something out of school activity, but then opening up other opportunities for them. Because I mean, this group also help kids think about summer camps. It doesn't have to be about squash. Extra tutoring if they're having difficulties at school, and they've brought in kind of Teach for America, AmeriCorps, and again larger philanthropic donors. And I mean, I know I'm really enthused about them, because I'm thinking that I mean, there are many entities like this, but I'm just so impressed by their drive, and they're, they're trying to do something bigger. And at the same time, all these kids are really enjoying playing squash and having somewhere to go. Yeah. So, I mean, something like that. I mean, can we look at some of these demonstration projects where we can see that people are doing this for themselves? There's no, handouts here. The state of Maine is actually encouraging a lot of this. And we all know how Maine has changed. Its tourism isn't what it used to be. Its mainstays of its old-style manufacturing industries have gone. Fisheries have been under stress. And Maine has been very open and welcoming for refugees. So Portland, Maine has gone from a predominantly white town, with kind of blue collar, a lot of working class, to a lot of refugees from places like Somalia and Afghanistan and elsewhere, as well as, like the rest of the United States, immigrants. And, the whole profile of Portland's changing, but they're bringing everyone in together.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good example, and one I'm certainly going to take a look at. And I think it's both a learn from these demonstrations, right, to obviously learn from them, replicate them, scale different things that work, etc. But it's also about elevating them, right, and elevating to what I think is, we've talked about here too, about this is one of the central challenges of this moment is countering the narrative that this can't be fixed, right? And to kind of bring it full circle where we started, it's using your book as a story, right, to tell a story of why we got here, so it gives some hope to try and paint a way out. That's critically important. So I mean, with that, Fiona, I know we're kind of running a little long here, but and where I started. Thank you so much for joining us, Fiona. I just so much look forward to continuing to work and talk with you on these challenges. And I know I speak for everybody here to well, thank you again for your service and your continued contribution.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thank you to everyone, for participating in this together as well.
Great. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks a lot.
Right. Have a great day.